Hello and welcome to the next episode of EBEA Consulting podcast. Today we have a pleasure to host Richard Thompson, Global Industry Director Aviation at Smiths Detection. His role is to define and execute Smiths' strategy for aviation, not only in terms of complying with security regulation, but also driving operational efficiency and improving customer experience in this rapidly expanding sector. In the previous season of our podcast series, we discussed airport security topics with experts from various angles of the industry. And today, we are back to continue from a technology provider point of view. Hello, Richard, and welcome to EBEA Consulting podcast. Thank you for joining us today, bringing into the discussion a very interesting perspective coming from the technology and equipment provider point of view.
Hi, good afternoon, Hubert. It's really my pleasure. I look forward to speaking to you today.
Thank you. Before we move on to the actual topics of our today's conversation, typically I would normally ask about your background and how has it happened that you actually now work in the aviation sector? What led you to it? What was the journey?
Oh, goodness. Well, so I joined the aviation sector 4.5 years ago, I guess now. I came from working in the oil and gas sector in various different jobs. I've been located in Singapore for 4 years through my career. I've had regional jobs involving a lot of travel. But fundamentally, it was related to the sort of safe control of the movement of oil and gas from A to B, which we all rely on. But the aviation industry, being such a frequent flyer, was always something which I think many of us that travel have an innate interest in. So when an opportunity came up at Smiths Detection, I was naturally interested, passing through airport checkpoints very regularly, like I'm sure you do as well. But also there was a lot of parallels. Really, it was, with oil and gas, it's a high value product moving safely from A to B as efficiently as you possibly can. And as safely as I say, quite regulated. And broadly speaking, that's similar in the aviation sector, except it's not just luggage, it's people. And that people element I find really, really interesting. How humans interact with automation and new technology. And it's obviously a very dynamic industry, both in terms of the growth that it was showing. But obviously, as you can see now, it's had a massive reaction due to COVID. So a lot of the opportunity that this period has presented is how we can use technology to recover better as we emerge from this crisis.
Absolutely. And I think that we will get back to it later on in our discussion, maybe treat it as a separate category of the COVID impacts, because it will be really interesting to see how you as the technology provider react to such unprecedented events, which put the aviation sector in a really difficult position. Before we move on to that, however, I would like to touch on more security-related matters, because we do appreciate that security, like you said, during the airport journey for the passengers is one of the most critical processes. From the operator's point of view, it is also one of the most critical operations area. It can be stressful, it is regulated. Like you said, there's a lot of integration. It's an interface between staff and technology and passengers itself. And there is a lot that can happen. And we at EBEA Consulting team, also we looked into the security operations and investigated them extensively, because if you think about it from the holistic point of view, this is something that we need to take into account as safety and regulation compliance, but also operational efficiency, and then also combine it with a degree of passenger experience and what we want this experience to look like. Interestingly enough, in the previous episode of the podcast, I was talking to Billy Shallow from Airports Council International, who's looking after the smart security program. And they also have the same viewpoint on how to combine all of those and bring those aspects under a single umbrella. And something that you mentioned about the interaction, I think that the interesting trend is on how to make it as flexible as possible so that it's down to passengers how much of an interaction they want to have versus how much of an automated journey they would like to have. So if we can now start, and if you could let us know how that looks from your point of view, and because you are looking after, this is exactly what you are looking after at Smith's Detection, which is how to define and execute the strategy for exactly these three, let's call them pillars: passenger experience, operational efficiency, and safety and regulation compliance.
So yeah, as in many businesses, it's a trade-off between all of these three. I think that, the first thing to remember is that we're there to fundamentally detect and screen and stop people with bad intent taking dangerous items, weapons, explosives, etc., airside. So by its nature, this industry is heavily regulated. You can't get away from that. So a lot of our business has been over 50 years working with the regulator and seeking compliance and understanding what the latest threats are and how our technology can meet the various criteria which the regulator are placing on us. Because in general, historically, the central search area in an airport was always considered a bit of a pinch point, not a very pleasant experience for passengers. And it was a bit of a reluctant necessity for a license to operate for airports. But it was regulated, so there was no choice. So I think initially, as this technology was being rolled out post 9/11, post Lockerbie, these incidents, it wasn't considered an area where you would give too much attention to passenger experience or even operational efficiency. It was just expected that this was a bit of a pain in the middle. I think, the next thing was the operational efficiency, because it's linked with passenger experience. But if you are in a country where maybe you've got 2 or 3 airports in a close area, so you've worked in the UK, I live in the UK, we know close to the region of London, we've got, Heathrow, obviously, Gatwick, Luton, City Airport, Southend, Stansted. There's a number of airports all within reachable distance. And actually, particularly post BAA, since privatization, the competition element, in a way, began to impact how airports viewed passenger experience.
Mm-hmm.
So they were aware that passengers were beginning to say, well, actually, the experience I had when I was flying on holiday last year was so much better at one airport over the other. And this was beginning to become a bit of a competitive factor. So this really stimulated the debate on passenger experience. The operational efficiency thing, that also, that's always there with business. How can we squeeze more out of our existing footprint? Can we improve the flow of passengers, the throughput of passengers? Because that drops through straight to the bottom end. What I would say is that while, let's say, pre-COVID, passenger experience was probably an equal impact on that side of the triangle to operational efficiency. So the regulation, yes, you had to do that. You had to keep regulated. That was your license to operate. But the two other factors, operational efficiency and passenger experience, in my view, were on average equally weighted. What's happened with COVID, of course, is that with the catastrophic amount of people that have had to be furloughed and laid off from airports, there's no question that, particularly in the heavily privatized areas, so in the European Union, only 25% of airports are state-owned or partially state-owned. The whole emphasis has been, how can we build back better? How can we build back more efficient? And in conversations with customers that my team have and I have, they literally, they can, in some cases, have thousands of security staff. And they're saying, how can we use automation to build back with double the efficiency? So literally half the number of staff manning the checkpoint. So while passenger experience is still there, just for the sheer survival of many of these businesses, the real emphasis is now turned more onto operational efficiency. So if you were to sort of see the triangle of the three elements, as you say, regulation, operational efficiency, and passenger experience, there's a bit of a bulge at the moment on operational efficiency.
Absolutely. A couple of weeks ago, just on that, what you mentioned and the impact of COVID, obviously how difficult of a situation the airport operators now find themselves in as well. It's coming exactly from this fact that because of the different sanitary measures, provisions, and sort of new operational procedures that airports need to comply with, we have seen a massive reduction in throughput. And now the way to mitigate it is, for example, having open more of the security lanes that you would normally would for the same number of passengers, which obviously increases your operational cost base, driven by the number of officers to man those lanes. So I think it's a really important aspect that you mentioned now. So from your point of view and technology providers' point of view, what is it that you can offer and provide to help the airport operators in this or throughout this survival mode?
It's not just one thing, Hubert. I think, it's several. I'll maybe start with an easy one, which is, in any case, the regulators moving more around the world towards using CT technology at the checkpoint. So you're probably familiar with this, but it's instead of having multi-views or dual view X-rays where you have a two-dimensional image for the analysts to look at, you're actually using CT, so the same technology you find in a hospital, to create a three-dimensional high-resolution image. And why is this important in the context of efficiency? Well, it's simply that you can drop the number of trays per passenger, because you're not asking passengers to divest their laptops and electronic items and their liquids out of their bag. They can leave these now in the bag, because a three-dimensional image from a security point of view allows you to see every single angle and virtually unpack the bag. You can actually digitally remove the laptop from the image, for instance, so that you can see behind it. You could spot any prohibited items, in conjunction with the machine automatically detecting for any explosives. So it's actually hitting two elements of well, probably all three elements of that triangle we were referring to.
Yes, it does.
Because fewer trays, and you can, in various trials in Hong Kong, in trials with our CT machine, we dropped, I think it was around 48%, the number of, I should say, the efficiency improved by a factor of 48%. And a large part of that was just fewer trays per passenger. That combined with a faster belt speed, and the fact that analysts were able to view 3D images just as easily as they could view 2D images. So that's one element, is the advent of CT technology at the checkpoint. I think in the EBEA CART guidelines, the Council for the Aviation Recovery Task Force, they also refer to remote screening, which is nothing new, in fact. So that's where, instead of having one analyst next to each X-ray machine at the checkpoint, you networked the X-ray machines together and you view the images in a remote location. So you may have noticed it in some airports. You'll see that there's no one actually looking at the images sat next to the machine. So they can be in a quiet room where they can focus, and it means they're on a slow checkpoint lane. They're not waiting for 20 seconds between each image. It's just multiplexing them so that you're constantly being fed images. So it has a lot of operational efficiency benefits, but also
it does.
Yeah, the staff like it as well, because they're away from the busy checkpoint. So it's not so noisy, and from a COVID perspective, arguably it's safer to be removed from the checkpoint area.
It also creates some other opportunities, and I've seen some examples of airports completely outsourcing the tray screening to a different location, which is a different airport in that case. Because like you said, because it's a smaller size facility, and maybe it would be more difficult to justify that extra, level of resource to do it in-house, and it just gets sent digitally to a different airport where those images get screened.
Yeah, I mean, and this is a really exciting concept that you talk about. It's not just screening as well. I think as we go and host more cloud-based environments with virtual machines and have this ability for wide area networks between groups of airports, maybe they're owned by the same state body or by the same company. But yes, in theory, as the latency issues and the redundancy concerns and cyber concerns are overcome, which they are rapidly being overcome, you do have the ability to, as you say, remotely locate multiple airports into one screening location, which has huge productivity benefits. But equally, one of the other things I was going to mention is, take, for example, if you're flying from the UK to the Middle East, is your whole baggage is being screened as you leave. We're focused on preventing prohibited items and explosives, etc., getting onto the plane, and taking those precautions locally in the UK. That image with the correct levels of security could be shared by the destination airport or shared with the destination airport. And in the Middle East, they might want to run particular algorithms on that image based on what they want to spot people bringing into the country. So whether it's narcotics or other items, you can run different algorithms on these images and use this capability that we're talking about, basically expanding out from multiplexing machines at a checkpoint. You could even start sharing this information internationally, obviously taking into consideration the various protocols, and as I say, cybersecurity being one of the key concerns here. But we are in serious conversations with several airports about how these proof of concepts can be delivered.
Mm-hmm. That sounds really interesting as well. And something that just came to my mind on the city, because I think it's a really interesting topic at the moment, especially in the case of the United Kingdom, because as we know, according to the regulation, certain level of traffic airports, they were supposed to comply with the city by the end of 2022. Now with the pandemic, obviously, if I'm not mistaken, there is a degree of derogation, and obviously the industry needs to recover and pick itself up again before we get back to those conversations. But it is an interesting concept, because on one hand, obviously it comes with an investment to purchase the new technology and equip a given security checkpoint in it. But it also offers a lot of benefits and mitigations to the current loss of capacity degradation, lower throughputs because of the sanitary measures and anything. So in a way, this can help you increase your operational levels or mitigate for those losses through the benefits of what the technology itself offers. It just, the timing itself for it is extremely difficult, because a lot of projects and pipelines are being frozen. Yeah. But this is something that could really help, especially for the constrained airports, to boost and increase the capacity levels again, while also combining the passenger experience, as we said.
I think, I mean, and each airport has its own criteria. I think you see like the large airports. So if we say there's about 500 big airports globally, probably 1,500 small airports. If we just broadly, orders of magnitude, what we see with the large airports, they tend to be more strategic assets. There's quite a lot of state intervention, and typically they'll have a stronger cash position. So they can afford to take a strategic look at investments such as CT technology, and the fact that in the UK, yes, you're 100% right, they've derogated from December 22 to 23. For large airports that were anyway heading towards 2022, they were thinking that, well, this is a 2-year program for us to upgrade anyway. So while a year's grace may give them more time to run pilots and to test out, proof of concepts, it's delaying their project by 6 months or so. And furthermore, it saves an awful lot of money carrying out these projects when the terminals are quiet. I mean, as we know, there's a number of terminals which have been completely shut. So while that's obviously not good from a project execution and implementation perspective, it's actually an ideal time to do some major infrastructure changes. So those are the discussions which are going on inside our customers and also with us. I think for the smaller airports, though, Hubert, I mean, the reality is that many of these airports do run at an operational loss. They really break even. They really struggle. So, in conjunction with the fact that these projects are, maybe it takes just 2 or 3 months to roll out a CT upgrade where you might change the machines, you might upgrade the lanes and the software, etc. Those airports are taking full advantage of this year's extension, and understandably so, I think. But yeah, the return on investment, while it's a good business case, the reality is where 18 months might have been a simple enough timeline for a return on investment. In smaller airports, it's really shrunk down to maybe just a few months. They're saying if we're going to invest in something, we need to see a return on investment within 6 months. So it's more difficult for them than it is for the larger airports. I think one other element here as well, as I've said, is state ownership. So, as I say, in Asia Pacific, it's nearly 90% of airports. In the Middle East, it's 90%. US and Canada, of course, it's nearly 100% of airports are state-owned or have some heavy level of state intervention. From an economic perspective, those regions with high state ownership quotients, they've remained pretty heavily staffed, and their investment schedules haven't changed too much either. So TSA, for instance, where we've sold 300 CTIX machines, they're continuing to roll that out and develop that program without really any difference in their schedule. Also in the Middle East, we've had some big wins recently at Hamad International as well, where they've invested in CT technology. That's proceeding with us, and that's going ahead at pace as well. But it depends country to country.
Understandably as well. And perhaps what will be really good at one point of time is when this is becoming more homogeneous as well. Obviously, with another benefit for the passengers, because at the moment the regulation differs between the destinations, and they might be going out from an airport with their CT technology in place, but then they could be surprised why somebody is asking them to remove their laptop or liquids. So obviously I think the industry-wide benefits coming out of implementation of those new technologies will be really important when we are back on demand in terms of the recovery from the COVID.
Yeah.
Thank you all for listening to the first part of our today's conversation. We hope to see you next week when we continue our discussion and talk about programs and initiatives to support aviation recovery coming from SME